a great program. And then on the 10th of April, we have Sharon Lobel, member number 1247, whose most recent adventure was a 2-month South Seas adventure filled with ocean exploration, cultural immersion, historical discovery, on which she carried an Adventurers Club expedition flag, which is a pretty special privilege to be able to carry one of the expedition flags here. So she's going to be talking about that trip. And then later on in April, on the 17th, we have Gavin McClurg, who's an adventurer and athlete with an impressive list of accomplishments. He was the 2015 National Geographic Adventurer of the Year, placed 8th in the Red Bull X Alps, held the world mountain distance record in paragliding. He circumnavigated the globe twice by sail, including a short-handed rounding of both Capes Horn and Cape Good Hope. So he's got an incredible list of accomplishments under his belt, and he's going to be talking about his many paragliding expeditions. And then we're closing out April with Kate Cooper Jensen, who's a globally recognized professional skydiver with an impressive record of over 14,000 jumps and 20 world records in formation skydiving. So she's going to be an incredible speaker as well. Further out, we actually have 2 of our speakers from May here with us tonight. We have Michael Yang, who's somewhere in the audience here. Oh, right there. Michael's going to be speaking on May 22nd about a solo motorcycle ride to Alaska and beyond. Michael's an incredibly accomplished motorcycle rider, both solo and with others, so it's going to be an amazing program. And then further out in May on the 29th, we have David Kolka, who's here with us in the audience today, right behind Michael, who's going to be talking about the Burma Road. So please join us for those as well. For now, I would love to invite up Vivian Callahan, member number 1251, to introduce tonight's guest.
Yes. Thanks, Mimi. Well, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker. Tonight's speaker is a physician, writer, and world-class adventurer. Her book, by the way, is on sale in the lobby. It's named Tap Dancing on Everest, and it chronicles her experiences being on a team of climbers as their doctor, though she was only a medical student at the time, and the only woman attempting a new route on the remote east face of Everest in Tibet that had only been successfully summited once. Not only was this route outrageously difficult and dangerous, but they did it without supplemental oxygen, Sherpa support, or chance of rescue. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mimi Zieman. So I guess we're waiting for the drum. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the world-famous LA Adventurers Club. And I'm Vivian Callahan, member number 1251, introducing tonight's speaker, who is a physician, writer, and world-class adventurer. Her book, Tap Dancing on Everest, chronicles her experiences being on a team of climbers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mimi Zieman.
Thank you so much. Thrilled to be here.
So, Mimi, how did a girl from New York City find herself climbing mountains?
Funny you should ask. That is part of the question I asked when I started writing the book. How did a girl raised in New York City, daughter of refugees, her father was the only survivor of his family from the Holocaust, end up in Tibet at age 25 on this crazy team? So I think, when you write a book, there's a novelist, Andre Dubus, in case any of you know him. He wrote House in Sand and Fog. And he said the best books, the writer is asking questions. So that was one of the questions I asked. And I asked, how much does our family history weigh on us as we make our decisions in life? Why do some people take risk, move outside their comfort zone, and other people like to stay safer? So those are some of the questions percolating. And the hope is that when the writer is asking themselves this question, and making discoveries as they write, that the reader is also making discoveries. You know, how does this story relate to me? What does it bring up and evoke for them? And that becomes then a conversation and a connection. So I discovered mountains in college. And once I discovered how I felt in the mountains, which was like a completely different person, lighter, happier, joyful, which I think is kind of a spiritual thing, I was drawn to kind of have that feeling again and again and again. And that brought me to the Himalayas and all my adventures.
So why did you name your book Tap Dancing on Everest?
Yeah, it went through several titles. This one seemed to be catchy, and many people think it's a metaphor, which it is. But it's also based on a concrete scene where I did tap dance on Everest. And it's because, there you go, Vivian, there's the picture to prove it. Because my first dream was to be a Broadway dancer, and that brought me a lot of joy. And when I was packing for Everest, I threw in the tap shoes in the last minute, and that moment in the book is one where I was fully myself, which it took a while to be, because I was on this team of male climbers and didn't always feel like I could completely be myself and express myself. So that's what the title is based on, and dance is woven throughout the book, because dance, like mountains, represents freedom to me.
So how did you meet these male climbers, and how did you become a part of this team?
Yeah, that's a good question. So because of my love of mountains, when I was 22, I decided to go backpacking in Nepal on my own. Now, I was a city girl. I didn't have a lot of resources. That year, I was applying to medical schools and waitressing to save money for this trip. I didn't even have enough money for a backpack, so I borrowed one. It turned out to be more of like a suitcase with straps, not a real hiking backpack. I borrowed a camera, but I went. And I spent several months trekking there alone. Of course, I met characters who were all in the book. And when I was near the Everest camp, met climbers who had come off a failed Everest expedition, the 1985 American West Ridge expedition. And a year later, they invited me on this next expedition. And they invited me to be the medical person. And at the time, I was 1 year into medical school. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. There's no way I could do that. Could I? And then I did not want to miss that opportunity. I knew it wouldn't come again. And so I worked to make that happen.
Great. And tell us a little bit more about the actual expedition.
Yeah, so it's the reason they are in the history books today is that what they were attempting is rarely done.
Yes.
And that is a new route on Everest, as you mentioned, with no oxygen, Sherpa support, very small team, lightweight climb, and on the east face. So the east face had been climbed only once before by a bigger team, and they were going to try a new route up it. And to this day, only about 15 people have summited from the east face, compared to over 11,000 on the other faces. I was away for 4 months, and we didn't see any other Westerners the whole time we were away. The climbers saw no other people on the mountain. So it was a different era. It was 1988. So in a way, my book is detailing a throwback adventure to simpler times. Mm-hmm. And as Norbu Tenzing, who wrote a blurb for me, the son of Tenzing Norgay, this was really done in the spirit of adventure of that time. It's a little harder to grasp today. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Tell us why the Kangshung Face that you climbed is so difficult and dangerous.
Well, it's remote and hard to get to. It's a very sheer 11,000-foot face with booming avalanches coming down all the time. So you all know George Mallory. Not all audiences do. The famous British explorer. He's famous for a few things. In the 1920s, he was asked, why climb Everest? What did he say? Thank you, because it's there. Well, what he said when he saw the East Face was, other men, less wise, might attempt this way if they would, but it was emphatically not for us. And that's why it wasn't even attempted until 1983, 81, and then the first team that was successful was 83. It's an incredibly magnificent place. And part of the reason I said yes was to be in that majesty. And I say in the book, I didn't go to prove anything about myself, but to be myself. And that's kind of what that whole theme of dance and trying to be your authentic self and your happy self is about.
Tell us a little bit about how you prepared for this journey. How did you get up to the place where you've set up camp, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so first, first I had to get time off medical school. Then I had to figure out how was I going to be an expedition doctor. When I was in Nepal, I went to the high altitude medical clinic there. I wrote down the name of the physician, and I contacted him right away. He was about to go on his first expedition as the doctor to Makalu, the fifth highest mountain in the world. And so he shared all the medical planning with me, the lists of medications and what I would need to train. And then I had to train physically. So I ran and biked and lifted weights and filled up that same pathetic backpack and with books and went up and down the stairs of my Bronx apartment building, my medical school apartment building. And Robert also asked me to do food planning and physical training planning for the team and corporate fundraising, which I wasn't, I had to try on these different hats. And this was before the internet, so you had to write letters and make phone calls and go to the library to photocopy articles on high altitude physiology.
Wow.
But then you asked how we got there and what the trek was like.
Yes.
Yeah. So when we went to Tibet at this point in 1988, it was closed to foreigners, and we were allowed in because we were part of a formal team. It was closed by the Chinese, and it was interesting to be there at that time. Some Tibetans would try to talk to us and tell us what was really going on, under the Chinese rule. And, we finally made it to the roadhead, and we laid out our gear. I think there's a picture of that. We had 120 loads. And the plan was that yaks would carry 2 loads each, there you see, to get to base camp. So think about it. At the time, this part of the world had seen an expedition in the 20s, in 1981 and 83. They hadn't seen much foreign action. We had deep snows, terrible snowstorms every day, and the yak herders quickly told us the yaks would not be able to go over the high altitude pass we needed to cross to get to Everest in the deep snows. So then we were wondering how we would get there. We were left in a camp with snow, trying to figure it out. And the plan was that they would find locals, and each local would carry one load, to go over this high pass. And it took weeks to get that accomplished. Meantime, we were just in tents, in deep snow, waiting, hoping it would happen. And then, of course, eventually we did get to a base camp. And the porters stayed with us one extra day to help us get loads to establish an advanced base camp on the glacier right under the East Face. And that's where we mostly stayed.
And what altitude were you at that point?
This is a picture of the camp that we were stuck for a few weeks. waiting for people to help us get to base camp. Advanced base was close to 18,000 feet. Yeah.
Now, you were the only woman on this. Tell us about some of the challenges that you had as a woman being part of this team.
Yes, there were challenges. I was very motivated by feminism, so I had this thing in my head like, I have to keep up and I can't complain because I'm representing all women. And so I tried that. Now, every night the men would we would all be having dinner in a tent, and every night was the same. The men would talk about every climb they ever did, who they climbed with, who their girlfriend was at the time, what paramours they met along the way. They would repeat the same stories. And I would be tearing my hair out. So I'd have to go to my tent and listen to some Joni Mitchell or get some feminine energy. I'd write, in my journals endlessly, which is what the book is based on. Never thought I'd write a book, but what else was I going to do? I just wrote journals to keep myself busy, to write out all my emotions. So unfortunately, one of the other things that happened is, the Tibetans kind of harassed me at various points on the way into base camp. And, it would make me feel vulnerable. It would make me feel angry that they were treating me differently than the men. And it made me feel disappointed. I'd have to ask the men to intervene on my behalf. They quickly learned I was the medical person, so they came to me for help, medical help, all along the way. And then I was sometimes conflicted because it would be the same person who just harassed me. And by that I mean making the screw sign or grabbing me. So it was a little hard in that way.
I'll bet. So you get to advanced base camp and you hang out. When did the climbers actually leave?
So this is a funny day. We were waiting to get to base camp, and we're all packed up, and the porters refused to go because of the snowstorm. So we took out the boombox and just started having a dance party. And when the Tibetans started dancing with me, the crowd went wild and just thought it was the funniest thing in the world. So when we got to advanced base, first of all, it was a shock. We did have a cook from Nepal who was part of our team, Pasang, and we hired a local guy, Kasang. And I was surprised to learn they were going to stay in base camp and not go to advanced base camp with us because they said it was too dangerous and too cold. And I was like, and I'm going there? This doesn't make sense. And it also meant that Joe and I would have to do a lot of the cooking because the climbers would be busy climbing. I wasn't prepared for that. I was preparing for all the other roles. So that was interesting. So we mostly stayed at advanced base. So the climbers, because it was a new route, they would have to go slowly up the mountain. Sometimes they fixed ropes, then they would come back down, then they'd go slowly up. And, this went on for weeks, months. And, most of the time they'd come back and we'd all be together at night. It was, the avalanche danger was so high, they would often leave at 3, 4 in the morning, to climb when the snow was hard and before it would really avalanche later in the day. The team was in touch recently, and I had never seen this footage. We only took still pictures, but there was some movie footage of a team that was there in the 90s trying to attempt the East Face. They were not successful, but one of the things that happened was an avalanche just shredded their advanced base camp. All the tents were just shredded. So I said to my team, wow, you chose our spot so well because, we were away from that really big risk. And they wrote back and said, no, I think our camp was in the exact same spot.
Oh, my God.
So, we would feel the blasts from the avalanches. We would hear them day and night, but luckily we didn't get caught up in anything. And that's what life was like.
So then they finally left You had originally 4 climbers, but one of them kind of dropped out because of altitude sickness. What happened after they left?
So because of the storms, we experienced storms the whole time. And so we kept waiting, like, when would the time be right for them to go for a summit bid? So they had established a Camp 1, and because they had no Sherpas, they had done several carries of supplies to Camp 1. And then they established Camp 2, and they went to that camp only once to bring some supplies up there. Then it came down. The plan was for the summit bid, they would go to Camp 1 on one day, Camp 2 the second day, and then for the first time to Camp 3. And Camp 3 was the South Col, which you're all familiar with from all the other Everest books from Nepal. It's the main camp before you go for the summit bid. Then they would go for the summit bid and come back down to us. So it was supposed to take 5 days till they would see us again. And they were purists, so we would monitor their activity using a telescope from Advanced Base Camp. We had no radios. We had no radio communication. And we all had different interpretations of why we had no radios, because obviously that was a big mistake. And I thought they were confiscated in JFK Airport. Someone else thought the Chinese took them because they thought we were spies and they didn't want us to have radios. Someone else thought Ed Webster forgot to pack them. And I just, when I checked with our leader this year, he said, no, it's because we were purists. It was a big mistake. We didn't even want radios. So when they finally did get a chance to go for the summit, we watched. And then on the 4th day, someone came down to us, and that was Paul. So the great thing is they did all 4 establish that new route, which I think at the time was the smallest team to climb in this way without oxygen to establish a new route. And that's the glacier we were living on. And they called the route the Never Rest route because they never rested. They had no Sherpas, they had no oxygen. So Paul, they were all 4 on the South Col, and he came down with high-altitude cerebral edema and high-altitude pulmonary edema. And in a very selfless way, he just kind of said goodbye and went down the route by himself to come back to us because he didn't want to compromise the other climbers' chance to get to the summit. And he came down, and then it was the 3 of us. And then they disappeared.
Gosh.
And then they disappeared, and for days and days. And you couldn't survive days in the death zone of Everest without oxygen. So we got to the point where we thought they must have perished. There's no other way. The one hope that we had is that maybe they met climbers on top and went down the Nepali route or some other route. Otherwise, we would assume that they were dead. And so my book opens with that, with us waiting, where we assume they're dead, and we pack up camp to leave. Joe, our photographer, goes to base camp to send a letter down the valley. Has anyone heard from the climbers?
Yeah. So you waited and you were packing up, and then what happened?
So then we were so grief-stricken, and it was just Paul and me left on the glacier. And so we took sleeping pills. And in the middle of the night, we heard voices. And basically, they were crawling back to us in very severe shape, dehydrated, severely frostbitten, barely alive. And then it was my turn to step up and take care of them. And we went through, a huge trauma together as a team. And that continued in base camp. It took us a long time to evacuate them. We had to build stretchers, get porters back to help us evacuate. And it's part of the reason that we are so bonded together to this day.
So you were boiling water and you really had to go through a lot to keep them alive, I guess.
Yes. Frostbite treatment, involves doing water baths, and I had 3 climbers with frozen feet, 2, initially 3, but then 2 with frozen fingers, 1 frozen nose. And yeah, it was never-ending baths of sterilization and wrapping, their digits in sterile things, and me always hoping I'm doing everything correctly and the best that I could, and me worrying that they could get gangrene and they could get sepsis, and they could die. It was, it was a big test, and it was.
So tell us about the trip down the mountain.
Yeah.
How did you get these severely injured men off the mountain?
Yeah, so it was a couple of hard days at advanced base, and then a very long amble to base camp because they could barely walk. And at base camp, we regrouped. One of the first days there, some people walked into camp, and we hadn't seen people for months, trekkers. And I heard that 2 doctors were on the team. Not only 2 doctors, but an orthopedic surgeon and a vascular surgeon, like literally 2 frostbite experts. And they came in and consulted, and I mean, it was the hugest relief for me and for the climbers to know that we had done everything properly. There was nothing else we could do. Frostbite is a waiting game. And I, consulted on the treatments I was planning and what we were doing. And Paul, who had to come off the mountain, suddenly became team leader. And Joe, the photographer, was incredibly compassionate, helping in particular Ed, who had the worst injuries. He couldn't go to the bathroom. They couldn't, dress themselves. Feeding, everything was difficult, and then building the stretchers and getting out. When we finally got out, and we assumed the Chinese would have vans ready to whisk us off to safety, and instead we were in this incredibly dirty hovel that was worse than me treating them outdoors in the snow. Now I had to treat them in this terrible, dirty village hut, and vans were days away.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where I say I came into my voice, because I'm demanding we need to evacuate these climbers, and that didn't really help, but it helped me kind of find my voice. And
So what's happened to everybody after all of this?
yeah.
You have a world record holder. Want to tell us about that?
Well, Stephen became the first British man to summit Everest without oxygen. So he's a very famous climber. And he went on to other expeditions. Robert Anderson, our leader who organized this whole trip, went on to solo the 7 summits, guide other people up Everest. They both had families. Ed Webster, who was on our team, was already a famous rock climber. He had these very severe injuries. He did go back to climbing. He even went back to the Himalayas. Paul is an avid climber and skier to this day. He lives in Lake Tahoe. And we're all in touch. We are talking about a reunion trek to the East Face in 2 years from now, maybe. We've been talking about that for a long time. we did have a very big 25-year reunion in London, a huge gala at the Royal Geographical Society. And then we went to Wales together, to the Penny Gyrd. Has anyone ever heard of that? It's an inn where the 1953 British team trained, and it's filled with Everest paraphernalia. We spent a few days there, and we hiked together, and yeah. And
Yeah.
I have to mention their books, because Stephen wrote the first book, Alone at the Summit, which came out just a year or two after the climb. And Ed wrote Snow in the Kingdom, that came out in 2000, a beautiful book full of photographs. And I said, Ed, what took you so long? Not knowing I'd write a book that would come out 36 years later after the climb.
So what about you? Any desire to go back and actually summit yourself?
I've never really had a desire to summit. For me, it's just the feeling I have in the mountains. So yes, I hike all the time. And I still hike all the time and go on hiking adventures. I'm going to Norway hiking this summer. But no real desire to summit.
What have you taken away from this experience?
I've taken away that, if your gut wants to do something, if it's a passion, like for me, my gut was calling me to the mountains. And I think that our bodies and our gut and our intuition knows a lot that our conscious mind doesn't necessarily know. It's worth following those instincts and taking risks. And you may not be successful, but you will definitely grow from the experience. That's what I've taken from it. And that's why I wanted to write the book, because I was hoping other people would see that in that experience and maybe take some more risks. And that's what readers have been telling me. Even really, really small things, like a man I know who read it and said, I was really upset about this move my family was making, because we had been in this house for 30 years, and I read your book and I realized, I can live with this change. And this woman I met at my husband's work, I write a lot about body shame and body experiences, especially as a child, and how then my body came through for me through dance and hiking, and again, listening to the body. And this woman said, look, I'm a 300-pound black woman, but I saw myself in your story. And I was just on vacation, and I wanted to jet ski, and I felt like, oh, they're all going to make fun of me, this fat woman on the jet ski. And I was reading your book. I was like, she could do that. I could do this. And then she said I had the best time ever. It was like one of my best experiences in my life. So that's what I was hoping for. For the reader to get something out of it. It wasn't, and writing it really did feel like another Everest. I say stretching into that doctor role was my Everest. It wasn't about climbing for me. Then writing the book was another Everest. And so, I do like challenges, And the other challenge in my life is I'm an OBGYN, but I'm a reproductive rights advocate. And I've had to speak openly about that, which is a sensitive topic. So I think the more we flex that courage muscle, the easier it becomes, and the more new and challenging things we can do.
Anything else that you'd like to add?
Not really.
Any questions? Are there any questions?
So surviving in the death zone, it looks like it was a lot of technical climbing. Not just did they get up, but how did they get back down being injured? And then going and climbing again, my understanding is frostbite, once you've had it, you're super susceptible to more. But tell us about all the really scary, ugly things.
And it's funny, this is the first book talk where I am telling the whole story, because usually I hold all the spoilers back, because it's a big part of the book, is like someone told me recently, like, I had to read your book twice because the first time I just had to find out what happened. And then, but I know you're a different audience. So, so they weren't in the death zone the whole time. So that's how they survived, is they had actually gone mostly back to Camp 3. But they were so hypoxic, so dehydrated and spent that they couldn't get themselves up to get off the mountain. They couldn't move. And you know, of course, they eventually did. So you can guess from the name of Stephen's book, he was the only one who actually made the summit. Robert and Ed got very close. And in terms of the frostbite, there were some amputations. And so then after that, you know, their fingers were okay, toes were okay, they could climb again. So Ed was the most severely affected. He actually had 8 fingertips that were eventually amputated. And he was able to climb again. But when we were going through this and the devastation, when we got to Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, we ran into Reinhold Messner. And we ran into Chris Bonington and his team. And Ed talked to Reinhold about frostbite, because Reinhold had already had really bad frostbite and had some amputations. And he was so reassuring to Ed. And Ed was like starstruck. Ed told him, you know, that a lot of people call him Tiny Reiny because he had a beard like Reinhold Messner. They kind of look a little alike, scruffy and bearded, like a lot of mountaineers. And so that was really reassuring to him. And it took a long time of recovery, emotional recovery, physical recovery, a lot of surgeries. But yeah, they all recovered.
Mimi, let me jump in.
Anybody else?
Let me jump in with a question. As a first-year medical student who played hooky to go on this trip, because that's an act right there to get out of first year of medical school. Did you or did you not do any of the amputations? Because we're always interested in the gnarly bits.
Yeah, that's a good question. That was my big fear. So I went in my 3rd year. I was invited in my 1st year. And that's a big scene in the book as to how I got time off, because I graduated on time and I was gone for 4 months. But
Wow.
so, no. The lucky thing is that, you know, and the doctors who visited camp said, you know, frostbite is a waiting game. You try to wait as long as possible and not amputate and hope for recovery. Robert's fingers looked absolutely horrible. I think that last picture with the Everest T-shirt and the black fingers, that was Robert, and he fully recovered. That one. Now, he did have a cellulitis in the middle of our trek back that I diagnosed and treated early, and it didn't progress. That's the kind of infection that could lead to sepsis and really serious things. So as long as you don't have an acute serious infection, there's no need to amputate.
Anybody
Thank you.
else?
I hope I never get to figure that out personally.
Okay. Oh, right. Yeah, I'm curious about how long it takes to get oxygenated, acclimatized. It sounds like you guys spent a lot of time up there. Also, in reverse, were you allowed, so to speak, to give them oxygen on the way down for the down trip, or did they not need it?
They didn't have oxygen with them
At
for
all?
the down
Okay,
trip.
yeah.
Now, we had one canister for medicinal purposes, and I did use that on Ed when he was down because he was in such bad shape, especially his frostbite. And that was it. Yeah. Did I answer the whole question?
Yes, part of it. The other part was how long does it usually take
Yeah.
to get acclimatized
Yeah.
for that kind of climb?
Yeah, so the slower you can take, the better. The longer you can give your body to adapt, the better. because we were stuck for so many weeks trying to get to base camp, that was good acclimatization. And I thought that would be it. Like, we'd be in such great shape when we got there, but it was still high for us. Base camp was 17,000+ feet, and then advanced base, almost 18. And every time we got to altitude, there was a toll that it took on us, every time we increased. But eventually, it felt good. I mean, I was jogging up at base camp. And I remember feeling like, because otherwise I would get so antsy and bored, and I was climbing little peaks on my own to 22,000 feet and feeling good. And that's part of why I was invited, is I did well at altitude. I didn't have the best medical skills, but that was one of the reasons. But I remember there is a scene in the book also. I had this dream about choking, and I woke up one day and I couldn't breathe. And it was because we were having a storm, and it was low pressure system. Every time we had storms, we were getting less oxygen, and we really felt it. So the guys were breathless also, and that was interesting to experience.
Just quickly, how high were you when you tap danced?
Close to 18,000 feet.
Okay.
Yeah.
What did people in med school say when you got back?
Well, one of my best friends from school said, I remember when you got back, you were just so grateful for ceilings, because, working in the snow, treating the frostbite and the snow is coming down on you was really tough. And I remember feeling like, gosh, I lived this dream. Like, what comes next? Like, how am I going to, go on? What's going to be next? And really, I was living on loans for med school, and the only really answer to that was to finish so I could pay back my loans. So I didn't really have options. I was invited on some expeditions, and I couldn't do both. I had to keep working to make my loan payments. And I guess I felt more grateful for things like telephone lines to ask for help. Wow, people could actually help me. I could call people. Because even when the surgeons came to base camp, they were there for 2 hours, and then I was alone again. So that felt really good.
Given the indeterminate amount of time that you would stay at advanced base camp, waiting for weather windows, them to keep kind of blazing the trail, how long were you provisioned for, and how much provisions did you have left when you finally descended?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I wonder about that too, because we did not run out. We ran out of some favorite things, like our favorite grapefruit drink and stuff like that. I remember the climbers were like, please, I need that grapefruit. And I'm like, sorry, we don't have any. But we were okay. I guess we just packed lots of extras. Luckily, originally I was in charge of food planning, and I was friends with this guy who did that for Sierra Club trips. And I got him we had a support team of people who helped us with logistics. And the plan was they would trek with us to base camp and then go home. Like the trek was their reward. And unfortunately, because of the snows, they never made it to base camp. But we had, another guy in charge of food, and we never ran out.
Questions over here?
Did you ever mingle with a Lakpa Sherpa who became sort of a celebrity for ascent of Everest in Connecticut? Or did you meet Sara Safari, who was a Persian woman who was the first woman to climb all 7 summits?
No, can't say I have. No, I didn't. I'm still friends with Norbu, he came on our team, the son of Tenzing Norgay. He was part of our support team.
Does he live in Agura?
He works for the American Himalayan Foundation for many, many years now, and he just told me that they're doing an Everest Day on May 29th at the Explorers Club in New York City to highlight the work of the American Himalayan Foundation this year. May 29th is the anniversary of the first ascent in 1953 that his father was on. Yeah.
So if you could turn the back time and do that expedition again, what could have been done to avoid those problems?
Use oxygen.
That
That's
was
the
big,
only way.
the big thing.
That's what put them at risk. Yeah,
Got it.
because they just didn't have the energy that they needed. And it does make your tissues more susceptible to freezing. So that's the only thing. And they wouldn't have done that. They were purists. So they believed that was the way to climb.
Speaking of that not being on oxygen, can you tell us a little about their decision process? You're always under pressure, you make poor decisions.
Yeah.
You lose cognitive, but if you're hypoxic, did they make the right choice to push on? I'm sure, what do they think? What does the rest of the climbing world think? Tell us a little in general about good decision making versus just going for it.
Yeah, that's really a critical question for climbers. And it's part of the reason they didn't let us on the route, Joe and me, because they were making split decisions constantly while doing the climb from the beginning to the top, based on years of experience and being so expert. They, I don't think any of them regret their decisions. I mean, they wasted a day when they were so tired when they got to the South Col. The original plan was to go up, start the 10 o'clock climb, and they took an extra day. So that was an extra day in the death zone. Then it was just very hard for them to move after they got down. Stephen actually had one of those high altitude bivouacs right below the summit, alone in the snow, no tent, hallucinating. And he survived. He waited till morning to move. That's when you die, usually on the descent, when you can't see. And Robert, and they all regrouped on the South Col. They I don't know if you can call it a mistake. They just couldn't get themselves to move from Camp 3 to come down. Eventually, Ed said to Stephen, "You got to move, or you'll never be famous for reaching the summit."
That did it, huh?
And that did it. They finally moved. They glissaded down. Robert didn't make it down that day. They went ahead. They regret that. Stephen felt horrible about that. Stephen and Ed kept moving. Robert didn't make it down that first night. He was still on the mountain. It was a lot, what they went through. Yeah, but it's hard to know. The reason Ed's fingers were so bad, and this is something I'm sure he regretted, was he took off his outer gloves to take a picture. We have that picture. He calls it Frostbite Sunrise. And even though he wore liner gloves, his fingers froze to the metal of the camera, and that's it. And that's why his injuries were so bad.
Yes.
Any other questions?
Well, if you want to go back to that picture, I'm curious about your picture. How long can you have your skin exposed? In your picture with the tap dancing.
Well, okay, that was at advanced base, and you could see I'm practically wearing a T-shirt. It could get warm at advanced base because the sun is actually quite hot there, and it's reflected off the ice around us. So that wasn't well. But at night, we did have to be in our sleeping bags by about 6 o'clock at night because it got so cold when the sun went down. And I would sleep with a hot water bottle in my sleeping bag, and I would sleep with my stethoscope and blood pressure cuff in my sleeping bag in case I needed it in emergency. I wanted it warm and ready to use because, again, the metal would get stiff and freeze, and it wouldn't work. So It was a big deal for me to learn a pee bottle because we didn't have the fancy things that people have nowadays for women. So there were some learning curves. But the days were not too bad.
Anybody else?
I was just fixing my glasses, but I'll ask a question. A lot of people that go that altitude. A lot of people that go that altitude describe the real challenges of intaking enough calories, and then this sort of like slow motion, I'm running as fast as I can type of a run. Is that something that you experienced, or did you find yourself regulating your energy differently at height that was different than what you had expected?
I mean, the guys needed a lot of calories. Unfortunately, I didn't need extra. My body was fine. But there is a picture of how wasted away they became, especially after their summit bid. They completely, their bodies wasted. Do you see that? How skinny they got?
Jeez.
Yeah. So.
Along that theme, I was curious when you said you were on your way up and you hadn't even gotten to the base camp, you were snowed in and the yaks wouldn't, they wouldn't yak and go over the summit. And you were there for weeks. What did you and especially the team do to stay in condition because you're snowed in? Did they snowshoe? Did they try to run?
No, we didn't do any exercise for conditioning, honestly, in those weeks. When the sun came out, we did have a day of rock climbing, and it was the first day the climbers climbed together because they were from all over the world. Robert and Ed had climbed together, no one else. So the 4 climbers we had a nice day, one day on the rock. And then, yes, so we sometimes went up to the pass and came down. I guess we did that for conditioning, and but we would still be waiting for people to carry the loads. So we didn't worry that much about losing condition in that time.
Anybody else? Well, thank you, Mimi. It was just fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us. And thanks for joining us, and see you next time when David McGuire presents Shark Conservation. Thank you very much.